Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing another Sharks player review. And for the third straight time, we have a former San Jose Sharks player. I promise that this was not set up to be this way. It just happens to be a coincidence that each of these players have gotten pretty much the same exact grade. And that player today is Jonathan Dahlen. Has a pretty short history with the San Jose Sharks. Was originally drafted back in 2016 by the Ottawa Senators, played a couple of years still in Sweden under their organization before being traded to the Vancouver Canucks in the Alexander Burrows trade. He played a couple of years in the AHL with the Canucks minor league team before eventually getting traded to San Jose in exchange for Linus Karlsson. He played a few games with the Barracuda, but going into the 1920 season, he wanted to head back to Sweden instead of continuing to play in the AHL, and so he went to the second-tier Swedish league and absolutely lit it up. Was fantastic in that league in not only 1920, but also in 2021, and so there was still some hype coming into the 21-22 season when it was finally expected that Dahlen would make that transition to the NHL. And not only did he manage to do that, but he actually came in immediately onto the Sharks' first line and made an impact instantly. He found himself by game one of the regular season on a line with Timo Meier and Logan Couture, which for a young player is a massive sort of I guess you could say reward for the hard work that they had put in through training camp as well as through preseason. And this line immediately paid dividends for the San Jose Sharks. As we all know, the Sharks started the season 4 wins and 0 losses, and in large part thanks to this first line. The Dahlen Couture Meier line was far and away the Sharks' best line. In fact, it was pretty much their only good line through many of those first 4 games. And on top of that, it wasn't just a fantastic line for the Sharks themselves. It was one of the best lines in the entire NHL. If you were to take a look at some of the more advanced stats, you would see this line right near the tops of many of those types of lists coming about, shots for versus shots against, or generally expected goals, things like that. So this was really a fantastic line, and Dahlen was a decent part of that. Obviously, Meier was carrying a large load of that, and then Couture was obviously a big part of it too, but Dahlen was maybe the third wheel, but still doing his part on that first line. However, past the first couple of weeks, the line did start to sort of regress back to the mean. It fell out of those top spots amongst the entire league in terms of very good lines. And it wasn't, completely dominant through every single game that the Sharks played through those first few weeks, but it was still a solid first line until Dahlen ended up going down with an injury around the middle to end part of November. When he would eventually return, which would only be about a week later, he wouldn't necessarily get his same lineup spot back, and thus begin the subtle decline of Jonathan Dahlen's season. For the next couple of months, he still played pretty good, but it was very, very spotty performance, very inconsistent. He could go like 5 games without a point, then suddenly he'd go a couple games where he gets like 3 assists or a goal and 2 assists, and you say, hey, maybe Dahlen is back playing on like a line with a couple of decent players, but then eventually would go back to being that inconsistent player. Would show up with another couple of goals in a game, and then back to being inconsistent. This would kind of continue until near the last couple of months of the season, where Bob Booner finally got enough of this inconsistency, and eventually Dahlen worked himself into the doghouse of Bob Booner, frequently became a healthy scratch for the San Jose Sharks, and even when inserted into the lineup, found himself frequently on a third and potentially even fourth line role, given very, very little minutes. And that was essentially how the season ended. And in the end, of course, the Sharks decided to not give him a qualifying offer, and it wouldn't have been a qualifying offer that would have broke the bank. It was just as though they didn't see Dahlen in the future of this team. Basically, the major issue with Dahlen is that he, at the end of the season at the very least, he didn't really seem to be good enough to play in the Sharks' top 6, and he wasn't really the type of player that Mike Grier could foresee playing in the bottom 6 that he is currently trying to construct with some of the players that he picked up and signed. Going into his actual statistics on the season, 61 games played, exactly like Rudolf Balcer's, interestingly enough. 12 goals, 10 assists for 22 points, which would put him about on pace for 30 points. However, you can't really say that with Dahlen, because usually when I say a player with 61 games was on pace for a certain amount of points over 82, it's because that player would have gotten to that amount of points had they, not gotten injured or something along those lines. But for Dahlen, the fact that he didn't play 82 games is not necessarily because of injury, though that obviously kept him out of a few, but there were also some healthy scratch games. Generally, if Dahlen was at his highest level, he probably would have played, 70 plus games in this season, only missing a few due to injury and the COVID situation he had to deal with this season. So 22 points, still decently solid, but unlike when it came to Rudolf Balcer's, Dahlen isn't really a player built to playing onto that third line. He just doesn't really have that type of style of play. He's very similar in that way to another Sharks forward in Kevin Labanc, but while Labanc does have a bit of a higher ceiling, it feels like, where Labanc could theoretically, if he plays at a very high level, make it into like a second line and actually be pretty good in that regard. Dahlen, I don't know if he actually has that next step. And you can see exactly why he's not really the type of player you might want in your bottom six by his plus minus of minus 25. Obviously, players will have a lower plus minus because they're on a bad team, but this is just insanely low. Dahlen, yes, he had those times where he was put onto the fourth line and onto the third line later on into the season, but even though he played like a good 50% of the year on these top lines, he still managed to accumulate large minus totals throughout this season, showing off that he is not very much a two-way player at all. And so generally, let's say you put him on a fourth line, and then that fourth line ends up taking an icing and the other team sends on their top line and their top defensive pairing and things like that. Yeah, you could probably rely on like a Scott Reedy or a Sasha Chmelevski or a whoever, Jasper Weatherby, to try and weather the storm a bit, maybe take a couple of shots against but not give too many great opportunities. But you couldn't really rely on Dahlen to do that. So this was just a situation where he didn't really have a spot in the lineup. Like I said, very similar to Kevin Labanc, which was why in my lineup prediction video going into this next season, I didn't really find a spot for Labanc, because if I kept him out of that top six, he didn't really have a home in the bottom six, and that's exactly why Dahlen seemingly was not given that qualifying offer. I imagine it'd be very interesting to see if Dahlen actually went the exact opposite of this past season. If he started off slow, was playing like third, fourth line, getting very few minutes, and then eventually later on in the season, he found himself on a line with Meyer and Couture for whatever reason, and then the last month he absolutely, lit it up. I wonder if he actually would have been kept on the team, but it's pretty much a business of what have you done for me lately, and Dahlen didn't really do much for the Sharks at the end of the season. And then when it finally comes to his time on ice, 13 minutes and 48 seconds does look pretty decent. That's, I believe, 8th or 9th on the Sharks in terms of forward ice time at even strength, and he got a decent amount of ice time at on the power play as well, almost 2 minutes per game in that regard. But most of the time when you take a look at time on ice per game, there isn't necessarily much deviation from that average. So for instance, a player with 15 minutes, maybe some nights they'll hit 16 or 17, and if there's like some sort of injury to a player and they're down to 11 forwards, they'll get up to 18, and maybe if they're having a bad game, they'll drop to 14, 13, maybe 12. Dahlen had massive variance in the amount of ice time he would get. There were times this season where he was up at 16, 17, 18, almost 19 minutes of ice time. And yet by the end of the season, there were certain games where he would be given 6, 7, 8 minutes of ice time. And those were games that he didn't get injured in. He just literally got very little ice time. So even though it averaged out to 13 minutes and 48 seconds, it doesn't really tell the full story of Jonathan Dahlen's season. So going into the grade, generally we have to balance it out. It will end up averaging out to a half decent grade, a very strong start to the season that if we had just evaluated him after like the first month and a half of the year, I probably would have given him something like an A-, something along those lines. And then if we were only to evaluate him over the last couple of months of the season, I'd probably give him like a D, maybe even a D-. But in the end, that sort of averages out to having been an okay year for Dahlen, as he gets a C+. Class dismissed.